Always choose truth.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
She is one of the most important people at the United Nations, and among those deciding the United States' foreign policy. As US ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power sits in the country's permanent seat on the Security Council with an all-important veto. Her term there has coincided with turmoil around the world, from Ukraine to wars in the Middle East and ongoing conflicts in Africa. Her job comes with another important role, a seat on President Obama's cabinet. But her links to the president go way beyond her current role. She's worked in the office of the senator from Illinois even before he decided to run for president in 2007, when he chose her as his foreign policy advisor. She'd earlier made her name as a journalist and academic, writing 2 best-selling books about wars and genocide. She made the case that after conflicts like Rwanda and Bosnia, the world should intervene to stop atrocities. On Talk to Al Jazeera, we ask how those past arguments apply when it comes to the situation in Syria, where more than 200,000 people have now died. Ambassador Samantha Power, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. In your job at the United Nations, all the world's crises cross the door of the UN Security Council, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Iraq, Syria, crises in Africa. Now, some of those are all-out wars. We'll talk about them in a minute. But some are places where the UN has peacekeepers. And there's now a record number of peacekeepers, 125,000, compared to the year 2000, where there was just 18,000. I know you're launching a push to get nations around the world to contribute even more. Explain to us what your pitch is.
Well, this is President Obama's pitch. From the minute he took office in 2009, this was a priority of his because he recognized that peacekeepers weren't operating in places far removed from U.S. national security or regional security, collective security. They were at the center of what needs to be a common cause, and yet often peacekeeping is kind of treated like a sidelight and it's on autopilot and the UN does its thing, but it often doesn't have the backing of powerful countries really lobbying other countries and looking deep to see what they can do to actually train peacekeepers, to ensure they have the helicopters they need, to ensure that they can end the recruitment of child soldiers, protect women and children. So from day one, this has been a priority of his, but in September, this coming September, President Obama is going to convene the countries of the world alongside UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and try to get countries that have been removed from peacekeeping in the past, who aren't necessarily doing a lot in other theaters in terms of international peace and security, to make contributions to UN peacekeeping so that the capabilities that the UN has at its disposal in places like Mali or the Central African Republic, where extremists could very well be taking root, that those capabilities are enhanced and more commensurate to the kinds of threats that look nothing like Cyprus and the Golan Heights of 30 years ago. They are conflict areas where civilians are in dire need of protection and where the peacekeepers often have a lot of will, but don't necessarily have the equipment or the capabilities they need.
So is one of those countries that needs to do more your own country, the US? Because you had, at the height of the invasion of Iraq, 170,000 troops there. I know you have some troops there still. You still have some troops in Afghanistan. At one point you had 100,000 there. Now, if I look, and tell me if the figures are wrong, but the records I could find from the UN, currently serving in UN missions, army and police, there are just 95 Americans.
We have a number of military and police officers serving in UN missions scattered around the world, but we have a military presence in 100 countries. So again, our pitch, President Obama's pitch, is different countries can contribute in different ways. We have 10,000 troops in Afghanistan still. We're maintaining peace and security with our Korean friends on the Korean Peninsula. We sent 3,000 troops to deal with the Ebola crisis, more than any other country. We've got 3,000 trainers now back in Iraq because of the growth of ISIL, and of course we're helping lead the air campaign against ISIL on the ground in Iraq and Syria. I don't think anybody can claim that the United States is not pulling its fair share in terms of international peace and security.
But could you do more specifically within UN missions? Some areas where you have special skills. Look at northern Mali. Those peacekeepers there are driving around in normal vehicles, not in armoured vehicles. Countries like yourself, like the French, you have that capability.
Right, and we have offered up to the UN, that's an example of a place where we are making a contribution for UN peacekeepers who are going to northern Mali, where the bad guys have been using IEDs, much like those that have been found in the Middle East, much like those our troops have a lot of experience trying to defuse, and we're offering that training to those troops who are going into Mali. Again, there's a big pie of international security threats, and everybody needs to take their share. It's extremely important that NATO countries meet the 2% defense expenditure threshold that they all committed to do, and that only a handful of countries are meeting. The fact that so many countries are spending so little on defense means they neither have enough to do on the anti-ISIL front, neither have enough to do on the European reassurance initiative vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russian aggression, and nor have they been making the kinds of contributions that they once made in the realm of UN peacekeeping. So again, the call is for contributions to regional and international peace and security. The call is to bring new capabilities online, as you say, specialized capabilities like those the Dutch have just introduced into UN peacekeeping. The French are, very active in northern Mali and have been active in the Central African Republic. They don't do it always under a UN flag, that's fine, but it's a major contribution to international peace and security. European countries used to account for 40% of UN peacekeepers in the 1990s. It's now down to 5%. So again, if they want to maintain peace and security somewhere else outside of UN peacekeeping, that's fine. We would welcome that. But right now the issue is that too few countries are doing too little when the number of threats is actually growing.
Let's talk about a country where UN peacekeepers probably won't be going there anytime soon, and that's Syria. Before you served in the Obama administration, you were very well known as an academic and journalist. You wrote 2 books about wars that have taken place in our lifetimes, places like Bosnia, Rwanda, Iraq. And reading your books, the main message seems to be, never again can this happen. We must intervene to stop this. We have a responsibility to protect the people. But I put it to you, in Syria, it is happening again. 220,000 people dead, and that's a conservative estimate because no one's even counting the dead. What do you say to that?
Well, every policymaker has to look at the tools that they have and then make a judgment about what you can do in the face of horrors like we're seeing in Iraq and in Syria. And in the case of Syria, where the Assad regime has pulverized its people, peaceful protesters arrested, tortured, barrel bombs on civilian neighborhoods, gas attacks. I mean, they are horrors that in many ways are unprecedented, at least the combination of those kinds of crimes. The judgment the President Obama has to make is, okay, so what do we do in order to mitigate the suffering? What do we do in order to bring about the kind of political transition that will mean that a man like that is no longer ruling a country and wreaking such havoc on civilians? And the United States has done a huge amount, including $3.7 billion in humanitarian aid, $400 million worth of support to the moderate opposition, a train and equip program that's up and running now that needs to pick up speed here that will move against ISIL, but that will also empower Syrians to be able to defend their own communities over time. And of course, an investment in the political track, which is ultimately where this thing is going to have to get settled. The one thing President Obama has not done is decided to make war against the Syrian regime. And that judgment is based on a belief that doing so would not necessarily bring the conflict to an end and could indeed make an already horrific situation worse. So I think it's fair to say that what's happening in Syria is revolting. The crimes that are being committed are unconscionable. But I think what is not fair to say is that the world has done nothing or that the United States hasn't done nothing. We have not ended the conflict collectively in Syria, and the division in the international community between countries that believe that Assad has long since lost legitimacy and must leave, and those that have pumped weapons and money into his government to keep him afloat, that division has been very costly for the people of Syria.
As the ambassador and also as an expert on war and genocide, you talk about those crimes. Are some of those crimes, like what ISIL are doing to the Yazidis, the dropping of barrel bombs by the Assad regime, are those acts of genocide in your view?
Well, I don't think the semantics or the lawyering is all that important. They're horrific.
You made it quite important in your book.
I make the point that when systematic mass atrocities are being carried out, the world has a responsibility to open up its toolbox and figure out what can be done to try to stop those crimes. That's why, in the wake of Assad's attacks on Ghouta and elsewhere around Damascus back in 2013, we made a move initially to use military force and then to dismantle the chemical weapons that he'd be using sarin routinely as we speak if that dismantlement hadn't happened. Each of these, the Yazidis, and what we did in order to try to rescue people up on Mount Sinjar, that is, again, a tool in the toolbox that we were able to deploy using air power and combining with Kurdish and other forces on the ground. So the responsibility is very real on the international community and on the United States to do what we can to try to stop these atrocities. But there's no one-size-fits-all. It's not as if there is a panacea either for Isil or for the crimes carried out by the Syrian regime, but on both, again, it's incumbent on all the members of the international community to step up. And in the case of Russia and Iran, that means not maintaining support for a regime carrying out systematic crimes against humanity.
You mentioned the use of chemical weapons, and back to the summer of 2013, the crossing of Obama's line, and then he decided, rather than to take military action, he got that deal with the Syrians to remove their chemical weapons. Everyone at the time said that was a success. Now, chemical weapons are being used again and again in the form of chlorine dropped from barrel bombs. Hasn't the red line been crossed again, repeatedly, and isn't it now time for action?
Well, certainly the allegations that have been made about chlorine use seem very credible to us, and the fact-finding mission from the OPCW has come forward with high confidence, which I think is the highest confidence that they have, that there's been systematic use of chlorine. And we are in the process of trying to get the Security Council to step into the breach here, as happened back in 2013 in the wake of massive sarin use, to get the Security Council to create some kind of mechanism whereby responsibility can be found and the perpetrators of such crimes can be identified. A strange anomaly, and in a way a loophole in the international system right now, is that the OPCW is only mandated to say that chemical weapons, or chlorine in this case, chlorine used as a chemical weapon, was used, but they have to remain silent on where the preponderance of evidence points in terms of who actually carried out use. And so it's very hard to establish accountability when you have an agency going in and just using the passive voice on chlorine use. Now, the reports are laden with reports that helicopters are flying overhead, the smell of chlorine results, and then people, including children, are dying without a cut on their bodies because of the suffocation from chlorine. So we think the evidence is overwhelming that the regime is responsible, but it's extremely important that the international system be able to point the figure for eventual accountability, whether through sanctions or through judicial accountability at some eventual court of law.
So you're trying to get a new investigation through the Security Council. Some would say, yes, you'll investigate again, but it won't stop the problem. What about something like a no-fly zone? Why is that not an option?
Well, any no-fly zone or anything like that it's the same issue. It's, are you prepared to go to war with the Assad regime? And you have to assess whether going to war with the Assad regime is likely to bring about the results that you seek. It's an extremely complicated enterprise, and it's one ultimately that if the Assad regime tests it would entail shooting its planes out of the sky. So I think sometimes people refer to a no-fly zone as if it's some sort of soft side option that we're kind of turning a blind eye to, when in fact it's a very complicated enterprise that brings about the very same legal, military, logistic concerns that have arisen in the context of other uses of force.
But military experts tell me you have aircraft carriers in the area. You could use missiles to take out those helicopters if you wanted.
I just think, again, many of the same people who sort of say you can just do X are the people who witnessed over the course of the better part of the last decade a war in Iraq in which hundreds of thousands of American troops cycled through that theater, in which al-Qaeda initially established a foothold, and great suffering was experienced by the people of Iraq, and of course a huge number of casualties on the part of American soldiers and others who were part of that conflict. Once you start talking about just shooting planes out of the sky or just sending ground troops into a country, you are taking on all of the complexity, a lot of the sectarian dynamics, and a huge number of issues that may not even be apparent on the front end, and that's a very weighty decision and judgment to make, and not one President Obama has been prepared to make.
One area where you are involved militarily is in the fight against Isil. That is going badly, isn't it? They're expanding their territory.
That is, I think, not accurate. Since the conflict...
It's now the size of the Netherlands, the territory they
Since
control.
the conflict started back last summer, ISIL has lost about a quarter of the territory that they controlled in Iraq. It is, of course, the case that Iraqis have suffered some pretty visible setbacks here in the last few weeks, including most recently in Ramadi. And, you know, when we say setback, we shouldn't use that as a euphemism either, because that means that ISIL, this monstrous movement, is moving into civilian neighborhoods and in many cases staging executions and carrying out horrific crimes. So you can't, any place that ISIL takes territory, you can't minimize what that means for real communities and families and so forth. But having said that, this is a complicated conflict. It is one that requires Iraqi ground forces and ultimately Syrian forces, opposition forces on the ground, to contest ISIL on the streets of Iraq and again of Syria. And in the case of Iraq, the divisions that have existed initially with the Maliki government and the Sunni population who felt very alienated by the way he was governing, and now some of the trust issues by the central government and whether they're willing to empower Sunni tribes, give them the weapons and the training that they need, those are issues that really need to be worked through. But we've taken 1,600 strikes, I believe, in Syria. ISIL has suffered major defeats in Syria, including in Kobani. They are just very good on the very day that they lose Kobani, a place where they sacrificed, I think, about 1,000 fighters or soldiers to try to hold that territory, which they said was very important to them. The very day they did that, they executed 2 journalists, and so the world focused less on their defeat in Kobani and more, understandably, on these poor journalists who found themselves in ISIL custody and were treated just as so many are who find themselves with ISIL.
Let's move to one of the oldest conflicts in the world, Israel-Palestine. Now, the US policy is you want a 2-state solution and you want negotiations. Why then are you stalling on a UN Security Council resolution to try and get that, which would have a timeline, a clear timeline, which would force both sides to the negotiating table?
We are not stalling. No resolution has been laid down. This is all.
Well, there was one, and you voted against it.
That was a very poorly managed process where a resolution was jammed before the Council with no negotiations to speak of on the text of that resolution, and it was deeply unbalanced and not one, I think that, not one that anybody really could have stood behind as a balanced way of getting at the interests of both sides.
And so many people in the Middle East believe that re-elected Prime Minister Netanyahu really doesn't want to do this. He's trying to find excuses not to do this, and they believe that you are supporting him in that, and all the while the prospect of a Palestine state is drifting away because Israelis are building on what should be that Palestine state.
Well, we, of course, make clear publicly and privately our opposition to settlements and to efforts to create facts on the ground. But I think what we are doing now is we are in a process of reevaluation. We believe, as I think do everybody here in New York, that a negotiated 2-state solution is the preferred option. It is the way, in general, peace gets made around the world. And it is the way it's going to get made here if the 2 sides are to live together in security and dignity.
You, perhaps like your predecessor, Susan Rice, probably faced the hardest task of any ambassador here since the Cold War because of Syria, because of Russia's opposition to doing anything on Syria, and now because of Ukraine. Are we going back to the Cold War, in diplomatic terms at least?
Well, it is very, very unfortunate, to say the least, and outrageous to have a permanent member of the Security Council lopping off or seeking to lop off part of a neighbor. I mean, if there's anything foundational in the UN Charter its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and Russia is the country that most often is citing sovereignty and territorial integrity as a way of avoiding difficult conversations about human rights and humanitarian situations inside countries. And yet here, there's a map, it has the borders, and borders are being treated as optional or as mutable by President Putin and his government. So we bilaterally, of course the Security Council is not available to us because the very country trying to take someone else's territory has the veto power, but bilaterally and working with our European colleagues have put in place a series of sanctions meant, of course, to isolate Russia diplomatically and economically, and meant over time to change the calculus of the Russian government so that these extremely problematic and destabilizing steps that they've taken and deadly steps that they've taken can be reversed. It is the case alongside that phenomenon and alongside the horrible division on Syria, which I think history will judge very, very harshly Russia's position on Syria in support of this regime, the Assad regime. Alongside those two very, very divisive issues, Russia is standing with the P5+1 on the Iran issue in order to try to bring about a peaceful end to Iran's nuclear program, to deny them any pathway to a nuclear weapon. They were part of the sanctions package up here in New York that reinforced our national sanctions and is a major factor behind why Iran is at the negotiating table. And now they're at the negotiating table. Russia's at the table with us, presenting a largely united front vis-a-vis Iran in a manner that I think, if we do get a deal, will be a major factor behind getting a deal. So we have to walk and chew gum at the same time, and we need Russia on issues of peacekeeping, whether on South Sudan or on Mali or on Central African Republic. We need them to be supportive of the Special Envoy's efforts to create a national unity government on Libya. We need to work together to pursue humanitarian pauses on Yemen and to bring those sides to the negotiating table. So we are not in a Cold War insofar as the Security Council is still functioning. It's not bringing about the results that we always seek in any of the countries I've mentioned. But for the most part, with the exception of Ukraine and Syria, we've been able to continue to work together to try to promote peace and security. And we need to keep doing that even as we express profound difference and put in place policies with regard to the stands that Russia's taking that are highly problematic.
So my final question, you've mentioned Iran. It's a pretty grim picture. Apart from Iran, where are the achievements at the moment? Where are the positives? And what is going to be, in 18 months' time, the legacy on UN issues and on foreign policy of the Obama administration?
Well, look, I mean, a lot of this is the dogs that aren't barking. We had, as president of the Security Council back in September, we called it the first ever Emergency Security Council meeting on a public health emergency, Ebola. There were 1 million people that were going to die, so the CDC said, and so many international health experts said, by January or February of 2015. Now we're looking at a couple dozen cases each week in the region, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, and basically in Liberia we haven't seen a case in several weeks, and we hope that the epidemic has been eradicated there. That's the product of U.S. leadership, the deployment of 3,000 troops, the deployment of health professionals and medics, and then the international community rallying behind the United Nations and by around the U.S. effort. We could be looking at a much grimmer picture today if not for U.S. leadership and if not for the convening power of the United Nations. I think so too on ISIL. Over time you are going to see this monstrous ideology exposed for what it is. There's a lot of glorification of ISIL being done by its propagandists, but there's also more and more the stories of what it's like to actually decide that you're going to go forth and try to become a foreign terrorist fighter, have your passport ripped away, be coerced if you're a woman, be put in sexual slavery, if you're a man who doesn't speak Arabic, you know, being on the front line, digging trenches and so forth. I mean, this is an ideology that is not going to retain luster even for alienated communities for long. And we are chipping away again at their territorial holdings, at the economic basis for their efforts, the financial underbelly, basically, to their enterprise, and that is going to continue. You're seeing a lot of progress. It doesn't make the headlines. We urge Al Jazeera to try to find the bright spots as well, because I think it is important to show that the international system, it is not a panacea, but things would be a lot worse, for instance, if you didn't have those 130,000 peacekeepers in harm's way, if you didn't have troops and medics and others chipping in on Ebola, if you didn't have the effort to deal with climate change and the reduction in emissions and so forth. People are making strides. They're not necessarily the strides that we wish we would see, you know, the large, long strides where you get to say, okay, that problem's solved. But ultimately, it's going to require countries coming together, citizens supporting their governments, making sacrifices, devoting resources, and we're going to make more headway.
Ambassador Samantha Power, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you, James.